Remember a version of yourself who believed her own word meant something, and somewhere along the way, that belief quietly eroded. This erosion rarely comes from one dramatic failure. It comes from 1,000 small ones, stacked so gradually that you never notice the weight accumulating. Sometimes the mind protects itself by minimizing each broken promise individually. It was only a missed morning. It was only one skipped week. It was only one more day of delay. And each of those explanations is true in isolation, but taken together, over months, over years, they form a quiet architecture. Not a wall exactly. More like a low ceiling you have grown so used to that you forget you are stooping beneath it. There is an old principle that keeps returning across generations, expressed in different words by different traditions of thought, but always arriving at the same center. Self-trust is not declared. It is built slowly through the accumulation of kept promises, especially the ones made in private, especially the ones no one else would ever know about if you broke them. Confidence, the kind that actually holds weight under pressure, is not built by telling yourself that you are capable. It is built by collecting evidence, and the most convincing evidence your mind will ever accept is not a compliment from someone else. It is proof drawn directly from your own behavior, watched by your own eyes. Consider what this means for the way you have been trying to change your life. You may have spent years chasing motivation, waiting for the feeling of readiness to arrive before taking action. But motivation is unreliable by nature. It rises and falls with sleep, with mood, with circumstance. Self-trust does not rise and fall the same way because it is not a feeling. It is closer to a structure built brick by brick from actions that match their intentions. When you keep a small promise to yourself, even one that seems insignificant, you are laying one brick. When you break it, you are not simply losing a day of progress. You are quietly teaching your own nervous system that your commitments can be renegotiated at the first sign of resistance. And a mind that has learned this lesson too many times begins to hesitate before committing to anything at all, because some deeper part of it already expects the promise to dissolve. This is why willpower alone so often fails as a long-term strategy. Willpower depends on force, and force is exhausting to sustain. Self-trust depends on repetition, and repetition, even in small doses, compounds. The person who keeps a tiny promise every single day for a month is not accumulating a large single achievement. They are accumulating something more valuable and less visible. They are becoming quietly a person whose word to themselves can be trusted. And once that trust exists, larger commitments stop feeling like battles because the internal argument about whether you will actually follow through has already been settled by evidence, not by hope. There was a man named Daniel who worked the evening shift at a distribution warehouse on the edge of a city that never quite felt like it belonged to him. He had worked there for 6 years, moving pallets, scanning barcodes, watching the clock crawl toward midnight while his body grew heavier with each passing hour. He was 34. He had once imagined a different version of his life, one that involved a small business of his own, something built with his hands, something that carried his name. But that version of himself had quietly receded, the way ambitions do when they are repeatedly deferred in favor of exhaustion. Daniel's private struggle was not a lack of intelligence or a lack of desire. It was a long history of unkept promises to himself. He would decide, on a Sunday evening, that this would be the week he finally started saving, finally started learning the carpentry skills he had once been passionate about, finally stopped spending his off days sleeping away the exhaustion of the ones before. And by Tuesday, the plan would already be abandoned, replaced by the same tired routine, the same late nights in front of a screen that made him feel briefly numb and then quietly worse. He had done this so many times that he had developed a kind of fluent self-mockery about it, joking to coworkers that he was, as he put it, allergic to his own goals. The joke covered something heavier, a private embarrassment that had calcified into expectation. He no longer believed his own resolutions when he made them, because some part of him had already predicted their failure before he finished speaking them. The quiet turning point did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived on an ordinary Thursday after a conversation with an older coworker named Felix, who mentioned, almost in passing, that he had been setting aside a small amount from every paycheck for 11 years, not because he had extra money, but because he had decided once, a long time ago, never to break that particular promise to himself again. Felix did not describe it dramatically. He described it the way someone describes brushing their teeth. It was simply what he did. Daniel found himself unable to stop thinking about the plainness of that sentence, not the money, the decision never to break it again. That night, instead of making a large, ambitious plan, Daniel made an almost embarrassingly small one. He decided he would set aside a fixed, modest amount from every single paycheck, an amount so small it would not even meaningfully change his lifestyle, and he decided the actual rule was not about the money at all. The rule was that he would not break this particular promise, no matter how small the reason to break it seemed in the moment. The first few weeks were unremarkable. He set the money aside. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no surge of motivation, no sudden transformation. There was only a small, quiet act repeated. Then came a difficult week, the kind that had derailed every previous attempt. His car needed a repair he had not budgeted for, and the old version of himself would have quietly raided the small savings and told himself he would start again later the way he always had. Instead, he found the money elsewhere, cutting back on something smaller, protecting the promise even though protecting it was inconvenient. It was not a large victory. No one witnessed it. But something shifted in him that week that had nothing to do with the amount of money involved. He had kept a promise under pressure for the first time in longer than he could remember, and the mind that had learned over years to expect its own failure quietly recorded a different kind of evidence instead. He did not become a different person overnight. There were weeks he almost broke the promise again, moments of doubt, ordinary difficult days where the old pull toward abandonment returned. But each time he kept the commitment anyway, the evidence accumulated a little further, and the accumulated evidence began to change how he spoke to himself in quieter moments. He began applying that same principle elsewhere, not through sudden ambition, but through small extensions of the same trust he had been rebuilding. He began practicing carpentry for 20 minutes most evenings, not because he felt inspired, but because he had decided this was a promise he intended to keep regardless of feeling. A year later, he had a modest but real emergency fund, a set of hand-built shelves he had sold to two neighbors, and something that mattered more than either of those outcomes. He had become, in his own eyes, someone whose word to himself held weight. The external changes were real, but they were the visible edge of something that had begun entirely inside him, in the quiet space where he decided again and again not to abandon himself. There is a kind of stillness that becomes available once you stop demanding instant results from yourself. Perhaps some seasons of your life are not asking you to move faster. Perhaps they are asking you to become someone steadier, someone whose actions and words no longer live in separate rooms. There is a quiet room before sunrise that many people know without naming it, the hour when the house is silent and the mind has not yet been claimed by the day's noise. In that stillness, it becomes easier to hear what you already know, that your exhaustion is not only physical, that some of it comes from carrying the quiet disappointment of promises you have made and not kept, promises that no one else remembers but that you have never fully forgotten. Faith, in this sense, does not require certainty about what will happen. It requires a willingness to act with integrity before the outcome is visible, the way a seed is placed beneath soil long before there is any sign of what it will become. There is a kind of surrender available here too, not a surrender of effort, but a surrender of the exhausting need to control every outcome. You are not required to know exactly how your life will unfold in order to begin keeping your word to yourself today. You are only required to keep it today. Tomorrow will ask the same small question again, and you will be free to answer it then. If you feel ready to explore this work more deeply, there may be something below that can quietly support your next step. There is a kind of quiet strength that has nothing to do with volume. Nobody is watching you at 11 at night when you decide whether to follow through on the small thing you told yourself you would do. Nobody applauds you when you choose the slightly harder, slightly more honest path in a moment that will never be witnessed. But you are watching. Some part of you is always watching, always taking notes, always quietly updating its private assessment of whether you can be trusted. This is the real audience that matters most, because it is the audience you cannot escape. If you feel that you have wasted years breaking promises to yourself, you are allowed to feel the weight of that honestly, without spiraling into self-punishment. Lost time is real, it cannot be returned, but regret, when it is not converted into responsibility, only becomes another form of self-abandonment, another promise unkept, this time the promise to actually learn from what happened. You do not need to forgive yourself instantly, and you do not need to pretend the past did not cost you something. You only need to stop letting the past write tonight's decision for you. The version of you who broke those promises was doing the best they knew how with the tools they had. The version of you reading this has different tools now. That is enough to begin. You do not need perfect confidence before you take action. Confidence, real confidence, is often the result of action taken without it, not the prerequisite for it. Begin small enough that failure feels almost impossible, and protect that small commitment as though it were sacred, because in a quiet, practical sense it is. It is the beginning of a mind that trusts itself again. There is a story often told about the explorer Ernest Shackleton, whose ship became trapped and eventually crushed by ice during an expedition toward Antarctica in the early 20th century, leaving his crew stranded for months in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. What is remembered about that expedition is not simply the danger, but the discipline Shackleton maintained through it, the small daily commitments to order, routine, and morale that he insisted upon even when the larger goal of reaching their destination had already become impossible. He could not control the ice. He could not control the collapse of the original plan. What he could control was whether the promises he made to his crew and to himself about how they would conduct themselves each day were kept. Historians who study the expedition often point not to a single dramatic decision, but to this sustained, unglamorous consistency as the reason the entire crew eventually survived. There was no guarantee written anywhere that discipline would lead to survival. There was only the daily decision to behave as though it might, made again and again under conditions where giving up would have been, in a purely rational sense, forgivable. You are unlikely to face ice and starvation. But you may recognize something familiar in the discipline itself, the choice to keep the small structure intact even when the larger outcome feels uncertain. There is an old story told in different forms across different villages about a farmer who planted a single seed and watered it every morning before the sun had fully risen. For weeks, nothing appeared above the soil. His neighbors passing by would sometimes ask why he continued watering ground that showed no sign of life. He would answer only that the work being done was not visible yet, and that this did not mean it was not happening. Eventually, long after most people had stopped noticing his morning ritual, a small shoot broke through the soil, and within another season, it had grown into something strong enough to shade the very spot where he had knelt each morning. The lesson was never really about the seed. It was about the quiet, unwitnessed consistency required before anything visible was permitted to appear. Your own mind is not so different from that soil. Whatever you repeatedly do in private, whatever thoughts you rehearse, whatever small promises you either keep or discard, are being planted somewhere beneath conscious awareness, long before any external result becomes visible. This is not a magical process. It is closer to a psychological one. Repetition shapes what feels familiar, and what feels familiar begins to shape what feels possible. A person who repeatedly tells themselves that they are bad with money is not simply describing a fact. They are reinforcing an identity, and that identity quietly discourages the very learning that might change the fact. It becomes easier to avoid opening the bank statement because opening it would contradict the identity, and the mind, strangely, often prefers a familiar discomfort over an unfamiliar contradiction. The reverse is also true, though it requires patience to notice. A person who begins, even shakily, to identify as someone who keeps their word to themselves will start out protecting small commitments almost instinctively, not because they have become a different person overnight, but because the identity itself begins to exert a quiet pressure toward consistency. This is not about forcing positive thinking or pretending a difficult reality does not exist. It is about recognizing that the subconscious mind learns primarily through repetition and emotional association, not through information alone. You can know, intellectually, that saving money matters and still fail to do it because knowledge alone rarely changes identity. But each time you keep a small promise, especially a promise made when no one is watching, you are offering your subconscious a different kind of evidence that is harder to argue against because it is drawn from lived experience rather than intention. I am learning to trust the small promises I keep to myself. I no longer measure my worth by how I felt, but by whether I followed through. I am becoming someone whose word to myself holds weight. I do not need to be perfect to be consistent. My past does not decide what I am capable of tonight. I keep my commitments even when no one is watching. I am allowed to begin again, as many times as it takes. Tonight, before you move on to whatever comes next, consider choosing one small promise, small enough that breaking it would feel almost absurd, and deciding to keep it for the next 7 days. It does not need to be related to money or ambition. It might be as simple as making your bed each morning, or writing 3 sentences in a notebook before sleep, or drinking a glass of water before checking your phone. The specific action matters far less than the decision to protect it completely without exception for those 7 days. Write it down somewhere you will see it, not as a productivity exercise, but as a quiet experiment in rebuilding trust with yourself. At the end of the week, notice not what you accomplished, but who you became in the keeping of it. That noticing is the real beginning, more important than any single outcome the promise itself produces. If you find later that you want a more structured way to build on this, there may be resources below worth exploring quietly at your own pace. You began this by recognizing something familiar, a quiet pattern of promises made and quietly abandoned, a version of yourself that had learned without ever deciding to, that its own word could be renegotiated. You do not need to repair every broken promise from your past tonight. You do not need certainty about how the rest of your life will unfold. You only need one small, honest decision kept completely, starting now. The rest will follow, not because of magic, but because trust, once it begins accumulating, tends to build on itself quietly, the way a seed builds toward a shoot no one was watching for. You are allowed to begin small. You are allowed to begin again. Keep the promise.